Okay, so yeah, we're talking about our article and for today, which is a research note on the prevalence of housing eviction among children born in the US. And this is an example of something called demography, which is more complex. So it's good chance, more of a mathematically complex version of sociology, so it's a good chance to sort of like pull insights out without necessarily engaging in it in the same way as a lot of the articles we've been reading. So it's good practice for if you're doing a term paper or something like that. Anyways, it comes out of the area of demography, which is the study of populations. Right? So usually this is literally in a lot of ways counting people. That's what demography really is. So it's counting people. So if you're interested in who in the United States experiences what, right, demography is going to be a pretty good way of going about that, right? Even though it's complex and difficult to read, like it still brings a lot of insights that a lot of other studies can't. You think about like a lot of our studies have been things that sociologists would call qualitative studies, right, where they're like interviewing people or watching them. It's really great on a small scale. It's not real great on a grand scale. Demography is the biggest, right? So if you're talking about actual, rather than theoretical explanations, if you're talking about actual like mathematical sort of studies or actual like empirical studies, demography is going to be sort of the bigger picture stuff, right? So what is this article particularly about? Think of a one-word answer maybe. In one word, what is our article about?
Evictions?
Evictions, yeah. What are evictions?
People are forced to leave their home.
Yeah, it's when you get kicked out of a place that you're renting, right? So this is essentially a demographic study of evictions. So within the article, essentially, just to give sort of a short synopsis, and then I want to actually talk about what's going on with evictions within the country, because I think that's a very interesting question, like why are we interested in evictions? Is that one, the article's displaying that evictions are a lot higher than we thought. So 14.8% or 15% of all people living in major metropolitan areas are evicted before the age of 15. Right? So you think about that, like that's a huge chunk of the population, right? And there's also like if you turn on the page, and I told you probably couldn't have read most of the methodological sections. If you go to page 401, there's this graph. You guys see where I'm pointing you? Cool. And if you look at this graph, essentially it's mapping the percentiles of people in which areas of income, right, in comparison to the poverty line, experience eviction. And so if you notice, the graph kind of looks like this almost. You guys see that? What I'm looking at? And so this is like percent below, so people who are below the poverty line, right, to like certain percentages above, right, 50 to 100% above. What would it mean if you're 100% above the poverty line? Essentially, you take the poverty line, you double it, right? So, and then you have 100 to 200. So essentially, just getting the idea of it, right? So the idea is here at the top is below, and then as you move up in larger and larger increments above being impoverished, right? And this is pretty obvious. What do you think is going to happen for poor people more often in terms of eviction? Yeah, they're more likely to be evicted, right? Where people who are, this isn't really all that surprising. the number for people. So if this is the overall population, right, the number just rounding up, because it'll be easier to remember. People below the poverty line have a 30% chance of being evicted before they are 15 years old, right? So the whole point is much like the last article, we kind of talked about this too. What does housing insecurity often create? Well, it creates sort of cycles of poverty, right? So we're talking about 30% of people very likely ending up in sort of cycles of poverty, right? The author compares this, I don't know if you caught this line, the author compares evictions for women and children that are minorities. So for African American women and children, eviction is like their version of prison, right? So a lot of men within poor neighborhoods, poor minority neighborhoods end up sort of in a cycle of poverty because of being imprisoned. Something that you're hearing a lot about in the news right now, right? The same thing is true of women and children, but it's mainly through eviction processes. Make sense? That's my real, like, quick summary of this article. And I mainly wanted to do the quick summary because I want to talk to you guys about the interesting, weird things that are happening with evictions. And there's a lot of history behind it that explains why evictions are so important. Because our authors, count data they're going to describe, but they're not going to ask why, right? This is a difference in types of studies, goals of your study, right? If it's a descriptive study, you usually don't ask the question of why. But I think why is an interesting question to ask about evictions, right? So to understand evictions today and why they're so important, we have to go back to 2008. Does anybody know what happened in the United States, well, worldwide in 2008? Yeah, sometimes called the Great Recession now, right? They didn't call it that at the time, but now it's sometimes called the Great Recession. Does anybody know another name for the Great Recession? No? Sometimes, and at the time, this is what it was referred to. I'm just curious, how old were you guys in 2008?
7.
7, cool. This is when I graduated from college. So I literally graduated and then the recession happened a week later. It was a horrible time to graduate. So sometimes it's referred to as the housing market crash of 2008, right? Does anybody know what caused the Great Recession? Are people at all familiar with this? Recent history. Too new to be history in some ways. Nobody? Yeah.
It was I'm gonna butcher this, but
Oh, dude.
wasn't it they were giving out a crap ton of loans because they had so much money for houses, but then some people couldn't pay them, so they gave them, they're more willing to be lenient as to how much you pay back or how quickly you pay it back because they had so much money, but then they ran out of money, so then they started asking for a bunch of it back, but then no one could pay it because they had such leniency on who could get the loans. So then there's people that could not pay it, and then a bunch of people got evicted because of it.
Yeah, I was kind of gonna say the same thing, but just it had something to do with the major housing bubble that we had and how the housing prices that kind of, yeah, it was basically everything that she said. But
Anybody want to add anything else? Yeah, sometimes this is referred to, and that's often how it's framed. And a lot of times this is actually framed often blaming the people who took out the loans, which is sort of an interesting framing. But there's something really weird going on that never happened before with loans. And this has to do with something called subprime mortgages. Because, in some ways we should ask, why is it that all of a sudden banks were offering loans that pretty on the surface, it's pretty obvious nobody is ever going to be able to pay back, right? Because it's really kind of what this term means, right? So it's essentially people, they were offering loans to people who could obviously did not have the money to buy the homes they were buying, right? Because that seems like a weird thing to do on the surface if you're a bank, right? Like offering bad loans seems like a bad idea as a bank, right? So why were they doing it? And then also, like, why is it that this all of a sudden led to a crash in the stock market, right? And these things don't make sense unless you know how subprime mortgages work. Subprime mortgages are tied in with a phenomenon referred to as mortgage-backed securities. And so this gets a little bit complicated, but kind of the idea is like this. So like, what's the stock market? What do you do on the stock market? Does anybody know what you buy on stock market?
Stock.
Stock, what is stock?
Shares and companies.
You buy shares in companies. Did you have something
I
else?
just say it's kind of like something you invest in or something like that, and the invest goes up, or stock goes up, you get a little bit of money back, or how much you put in.
Yeah. So you buy shares of a company to essentially and what are you doing? You're basically betting on the success of that company. Well, what happens if you're if you're a company that doesn't look like it's going to be successful?
You lose money.
What's that?
Don't you lose money?
You could lose money, but so like, let's say I'm gonna do a real risky stock. I have some great grand idea for a company, but nobody really knows if it's going to float or not. But I decide to go public. Well, this happens all the time. It's not a good investment. But there's ways of mitigating that. One of which is that you pool your stock with other stock. Does that make sense? So you can buy a package of stock rather than an individual company. Does that make sense? And a lot of times at this time, what they were doing is they were buying off a part of a mortgage and pooling it with their stock. And what they were buying of the mortgage was something which was essentially the risk. So it allowed banks to take any risk that they had in their loan and essentially sell it off to somebody else. So that if somebody didn't pay their loan back, the bank wasn't out anything. Somebody else was holding the risk. Does that make sense? So the bank was making profit off the loan, but selling the risk so that people could tie it to their stocks. Does that make sense? Do you guys kind of following that? They do this on something called the futures market. And before the late 90s, nobody used the futures market this way. The futures market so the futures market isn't in the stock market. It's in Chicago. And generally speaking, in the United States, this future market was just used by farmers. Anybody here come from a farm family? Nobody here comes from farmers? No? I'm the only one who comes from farmers. Okay. So often, like, farmers will sell, essentially, if they're going to plant something, right, what they'll do is they will basically make a bet that even if they don't bring in X amount of crops, they'll count it as it. Or they'll make a bet that essentially, like, that when they go to sell the grain will be at this price, right? So they can hedge their bets. And how they do that is by selling the risk of their grain on the futures market. And so any agricultural crop usually has this, and people will either buy into it or they won't, depending on how they think they're going to do, right? But it's sort of like an insurance policy for farmers, and it's originally what that was for. But in the late 90s, banks started using the futures market to sell risk. At the same time, they're giving out all these subprime mortgages, and essentially what happens is because they're giving bad loans, a bunch of people default on their loans all around the same time in 2008. And it sinks all the stocks that had tied themselves to the futures. So all the mortgage-backed securities flopped all at once. Most of the people who bought these didn't even know what they were buying. They were just numbered items off of the market. And people all over the world had been backing their own stock with American loan risk. Does this make sense? That's what caused the housing market of 2008. There's a reason why I'm bringing this up and why it has to do with evictions. So, does anybody know the historic relationship between the price of houses and the price of rent? What happens if houses get more expensive? As a general rule, they go in the opposite direction. So when rent's high, housing is low. When housing is low, rent is high. Right? Does it make sense? This stopped happening after 2008. So after 2008, they stopped doing mortgage-backed securities, and banks started to do rent-backed securities. So essentially, we shifted from rent-backed securities because it was less risky. It was less risky for a few reasons. One of which is, okay, so you have a house, right? Let's say you're selling a house, right? The bank, somebody takes a bank loan, they buy the house, right? What happens if they fail to pay the bank? What happens? Anybody know this? Eventually you'd get evicted, right? But it takes a really long time for people to get kicked out of the houses that they buy. If you're renting, how easy is it for you to get kicked out? It's really easy, right? So the advantage is that essentially to the banks, they look at it as an advantage that they can just kick people out and get somebody new in there right away so they don't lose anything on the investment, right? There's also like a weird thing about, does anybody know what happens? So anybody here ever have a bad landlord? No? Nobody ever had rented an apartment where they didn't fix things, stuff like that? Technically, there's all kinds of rules governing rent, right? What landlords have to do and what tenants have to do. But you can't sue a landlord in regular court, right? You have to go to what's colloquially referred to as rent court. Rent court almost unilaterally sides with the landlord, right? So it becomes very hard to challenge it. So if you guys, how many of you guys think you're going to buy or rent an apartment off campus someday in the next 4 years? Okay, so when you guys go to rent, you might get a landlord who, like, your sink breaks. You call them and they're like, whatever, and they just don't do it, right? What's your recourse? What can you do? Because like legally, like they signed a document that says that they have to fix your sink, right? They have to provide all these essential things, right? What do you do? What do you think? What are you gonna do if your landlord just starts letting the place, let's say like a tree falls down, there's a big hole in the roof. You ask your landlord to fix it, they say they won't. What do you do?
Sue them?
You could sue them. So you go to tenant court. Do you know what happens when you go to tenant court? You end up on tenant blacklist. There's long lists held by independent companies that landlords use to decide whether you're a good person to rent from or not. Your name goes on the tenant list. It also hurts your credit score, right? So if you sue them, automatically, before whether you win or lose, you automatically go on the blacklist. Okay, what else could you do? Which means that, so yeah, so what other recourse do you have if you have a landlord who won't fix something? Just looking for you guys to guess. This doesn't have to be, yeah.
You fix it yourself, or you pay someone, like a plumber to come and fix it?
You could fix it yourself, but technically speaking, if you fix your own rental property, you're in breach of contract. And so technically, you could be evicted or you could be sued by the landlord for damages. Right? Okay, what else can you do? Giant hole in the roof, tree fell on it, right? You're just living in the rain. What else can you do? You can just move out, right? Well, you just broke your lease, which means you're in breach of contract, which means that you can be blacklisted by the landlord, right? So going back to the point, so you get on a blacklist. Let's say you go to rent someplace else. Well, they run your name. Has anybody anybody here have parents that rent at all, or nobody lives in that? Some people, right? Do you know what you have to do when you go to rent a place? What the landlord does? They do a background check on you, right? This pops up. So what kind of apartments or houses or et cetera do you think you can get when you're blacklisted? Yeah, you're essentially being relegated to the worst apartments in the city, right? So you think about this sort of situation, right? This gives a lot of control. So getting back to the idea, right, banks were like, well, a mortgage is run by regular court. There's all this risk involved, right? We sell off the risk, it could damage us. So why don't we sell off the risk to large housing complexes in major cities that we buy up, right? And increasingly, like a lot of your particularly like large housing complex that you see if you drive into a major city, the ones out in the suburbs, all these things are increasingly owned by these subsidiary companies of banks that use them to create rent-backed loans, rent-backed securities on people's stock. And it means things that, like, often they'll evict people for asking to have things fixed, which keeps them from having to pour cost into the places that they own, right? It also means that because of this sort of weird rent backing system, it means that they can essentially create at will housing shortages, which is exactly what is happening in the country right now. So we have a housing shortage on one end because material costs are too high and nobody's building homes anymore. And then on the other end, we have a housing shortage because of this. So we're in a really unique point in history where both rent and houses are going up at the exact same time. So we're getting increased rent cost and increased housing cost, right? Like if you bought a house right after the market crash, so I bought a house even for quite a few years after it, right? So like I bought a house in, let me see, so 2008. I bought a house 7 years later for like $40,000 and then sold it for almost $70 2 years later, right? So housing went up a lot in this period, right? In the recent history, right? And it's still going up right now. If you looked at like housing prices in Atchison, right? Like they're slowly climbing. They're going up on average about 5 to 10 grand a year, you know? And so they're going up at the exact same time rent is going up. And does anybody know what's happened with wages since 2008? They've stagnated. So they're staying constant. Which means that by and large, people are spending more and more percent of their income on housing. And in fact, if you were to look back, since the 1970s in particular, we've seen huge growths in how much people pay for basic living costs, like what percentage of their income goes to it. So like food prices are higher than they were back then, housing prices are higher than they were back then, car prices are higher than they were back then. So the basic things that people need to get by take up larger and larger chunks of their income. Now this is true regardless of what social class you're belonging to for the most part. Like if you're middle class or below, for younger people, like I think like the national average, the last time I looked for, is that the national average was that people spent a quarter of their income on rent, right? Rent being like your housing cost, right, in general. So a quarter of their income, if you went back in the 70s, it's like 5-6% of their income usually was spent on housing, right? So you think about like differences, right, across time and people's purchasing power, right? But what makes this even harder is, and what to some degree our article is pointing out, is that whose rent do you think has disproportionately gone up? Who primarily lives in very large housing complexes? Who lives in large housing complexes for the most part? You get some like really expensive high rises in the downtown, right? But what are most large housing complexes owned? Like who lives there? It's a week on inequality. Should be good guesswork. What's that? The urban poor, right? The urban poor have a tendency to live in large housing complexes, right? If you, on average, they're more likely to, right? So increasingly, their rent is going up even faster than everyone else's. Also, like, generally speaking, if you're poor, what can't you do? Do you think most poor people can buy homes? Why not? Yeah, they don't have enough money. If they did have enough money, they probably can't get a loan, you know? So like the thing is like, because you got to prove income to get loans. You got to prove, right, ... right? You have to show, if anyone ever goes to take a house, like if somebody gives you money, so like the first house I bought, my parents gave me money to help me get over PMI, which is, we don't have to get into what that is. Anyways, that's stuff you can worry about when you're an adult. Anyways, but the point is that like, I had to like, get letters signed by them of where they got the money that they gave to me, right? So you think about how hard it is, right? And how much of a paper trail there is to these sort of things, right? That essentially people are forced into just renting. So if rent costs go up, it directly affects people's lives in a very different way. So throughout this period, what we're seeing is increasing eviction rates, right, which is something that's a major replicant of poverty over time. It really hurts people's life circumstances. Make sense? Okay, so that's kind of what's tied up in here. Has anybody been following what's happened with evictions in COVID-19? So what happened to a lot of people when this last year in terms of work?
Lost their jobs.
A lot of people lost their jobs, right? People who could stay at home and work did, right? But a lot of people just flat out lost the jobs that they do, or they were laid off without pay, right? So what do you think that does in terms of, especially if you're thinking about the percentages that people are spending on housing, what do you think that does in terms of people being able to pay their housing costs? If you're not bringing in income, how likely are you to be able to pay your housing costs if 50% of your income goes to housing costs?
You're more likely to be evicted because you can't pay your rent.
Yeah, you can't pay your rent, so you'd be more likely to be evicted. Now, they put a hold on evictions. Did you guys hear this? Right? So they put a hold on evictions. They weren't evicting people during the stay-at-home orders, right? Which are now over, of course. But what they didn't do is they didn't forgive any of the rent, which meant that people were just compiling more and more rent without being employed. So however long they were actually allowed to not be evicted, right, they're given a stay on paying their rent, that just accumulated. So now, rather than having to pay their landlord, you know, $1,200, they had to pay them $17,000, right, or whatever, right? All at once due, and if they didn't, what do you think happened? They get evicted. What do you think happens when you get evicted and you owe money still to your landlord? What do?
Take it to court.
They take you to court, right? And the court makes you pay. They seize future wages, etc., right? So what we're seeing here, right, is a really changing housing landscape, right, that disproportionately affects, right, your poor in various ways. Make sense? Cool. Okay, I'm gonna talk. Both of these articles kind of nodded at something, or at least talked about it, one aspect of something, which is the replication of class. So I thought we'd spend a little time talking about the replication of class. Both why we shouldn't view this as deterministic, but also how weird and multifaceted this can be. Particularly, I'm going to look at something that's sometimes referred to as replication theory, which was started by somebody by the name of Pierre Bourdieu. And Pierre Bourdieu likes to talk about what he refers to as forms of capital. Is anybody familiar with the use of the word capital, other than like the building that houses governments, or the cities that house governments? A different definition than that. Anybody familiar with? Yeah.
Just like anything that has value, like assets.
Yeah, so we talk about financial capital, right? So in a lot of ways, in Pierre Bourdieu's world, we compete over capital with other people, right? Which isn't really all that surprising, right? We compete for money with other people in the market, right? We compete with forms of wealth. But what he wants to claim is in that competition, that's not preordained, right? Having wealth helps you get more wealth, but it doesn't mean that you always win. Right, so other people can go up and down. You know, there is such a thing as mobility, even though the chances of it aren't great. In Pierre Bourdieu's framing, he likes to refer to this competition as the field. Right, that in the field, like things happen. Right, we actively compete, and he uses the image of a field like his mind here is like a soccer field. Right, and so the idea is that there's kind of parameters to the competition that we have. There's rules set out. Those rules may benefit certain populations, but it doesn't preordain what's going to happen, right? So in the field, things can change. We're competing, right? But by and large, they don't. By and large, class replicates. For Bourdieu, he wants to explain, because we talked about that last class, right? That by and large, whatever social class you start in is usually where you're going to end up. And so Pierre Bourdieu is attempting to explain that it's not just like, so if we're thinking about it just in terms of money, it doesn't seem like it should necessarily work out that way, right? Like, you have access to things that you could make money on. Anybody could play the stock market. You could have very little money, play the stock market well, come out ahead, and somebody who has a lot of money could play it poorly and lose, right? So why is it that in this world, right, things have a tendency to replicate across time? And he wants to claim that there's actually more forms of capital than just financial capital. right? He wants to claim that we have cultural capital, as in, well, actually, I want to pause here for a moment. So, to get us thinking about the other forms of capital, let's have a hypothetical situation. So, let's say you guys want to be rich. Does anybody here want to be rich? Some people want to be rich, not everybody. Okay, so you want to be rich, and you see an advertisement online for a job, CEO of Goldman Sachs, right? Get to be on the board, make important decisions, right? Make a lot of money. I always go there because I had a friend whose roommate in undergrad actually became somebody up in Goldman Sachs, which is a major New York corporation. His job really sucks. It sounds horrible. I would hate being rich, but that's the point. It's best not to be poor or rich, I think, you know. But anyways, so let's say you want to be rich and you see this and you apply for it and you get an interview. What do you wear to your interview?
Nice clothes.
Okay, what are nice clothes? What would be nice enough clothes?
It depends on the job.
Well, I'm talking about, you know, on the board at Goldman Sachs,
Really
like,
nice suit.
what's that?
Really nice suit.
Really nice suit. Where do you get one of these suits?
Um,
You know, you're talking about a job where you're gonna pull in, you know, $3 billion a year, you know, like what kind of suit you gonna wear?
Really
Something from
expensive.
Men's Warehouse.
Something from Men's Warehouse.
I think that's what's called.
What else? Do you think that would be a nice enough suit, or do you think people, what do you think they would think when they looked at it?
You could probably get an expensive one that's like tailored so that you know it'll fit you right.
Yeah, you're gonna have to get a hand-tailored suit. Will any tailor do? No, you're gonna have to get it from the right tailors. The tailors that know what people are wearing right now, what they're not wearing right now. You don't want to wear last year's suit to this job interview. You want to look like you buy, you know, a $5,000 suit every, you know, $25,000 suits every year that you throw away when it's done, right? That's what you want to do, right? So, would you even know how to start finding that clothing? No. Well, let's say you got a nice guy. This guy who runs the company, like, he's not, you know, he's not going to be looking at your suit and judging you. Like, you know, he's views himself as more objective than that. You get in there, he's like, well, we're going to have to change your clothes, but, you know, let's go have a meeting. Let's get some dinner. Right? He takes you out to a restaurant. Anybody here ever been to any really expensive restaurants? Like really, really expensive restaurants, like $100 a plate kind of thing. I used to have, what's that? No. I used to have a friend who was a chef, and he could get discounts. So like we would go to major cities and like eat things. I have to admit, like I go into a place like that, I don't know what things are on the menu. Like I like pickled quail eggs and crap like that. Like what in the heck is this stuff? Like I don't really know how to eat it properly, so on and so forth. So let's say he takes you to one of these restaurants, not thinking anything of it, like it's just a restaurant he likes to go to, right? Are you going to be able to talk about the food you're eating very well? No. Why? What's that?
Because you never had it, you can't afford it, or need it.
Yeah, and so these sort of weird implicit things, right? There's different social classes actually have different cultures. It's sort of Pierre Bourdieu's point, right? They have different preferences, different things they like, different ways of speaking, different ways of acting, different ways of dressing, right? So, but we don't treat these things equally in our culture. We don't treat class culture equally. You know? We treat them differently from one another. We place value on some forms of culture and not others, right? And we may place value, so this gets kind of confusing because sometimes there's weird inversions, right? We may place value on aspects of lower class culture, right? In a temporary sort of way. But once those values placed on it, it gets sort of absconded by the upper class, right? A good example of this would be something like if you go to like a hipster bar in like a major metropolitan area, what do people have a tendency to drink other than like really expensive like IPAs?
Kombucha.
What's that?
Kombucha.
Kombucha. No, I think that's all really still counts as capital. Although you could claim that it was once not capital and they absconded it from Asians and started drinking it, and then it became something wealthy people did. You get hipsters with tall boys and Pabst Blue Ribbon or something like that, right? Like this is kind of a weird inversion, so that happens sometimes, right? But that's still like people concretizing other people's culture, right? But by and large, people are going to be able to make judgments. And a lot of times there's things that we do that and middle class people do this to lower class people, upper class people do it to middle class people. You know, so essentially like we often judge each other through these sort of cultural lenses, right? This is also things like when people talk about something like improper English. Really what they're talking about is just them placing value on different cultures of speaking, right? Like a good example of this, like if somebody came to a job interview and spoke like something like Caribbean vernacular English, right, which is sort of like the accent we associate with like Rastafarians, right? People might view that as them speaking improper English. Grammatically, it's actually a more complex language than standard Midwestern English, right? So what makes it improper? Just the fact that it's poor black people who speak it, right? So we place value on it differently. Does it make sense? So no matter what, like we end up butting up against these cultural values. And these often are really embedded. So Pierre Bourdieu likes to talk about what he calls habitus. That our forms of capital are often embedded in the way we move our bodies, the way we walk, right? Things like that, right? Even our body type. You can think about activities. So like, if you think about something like even outside of like genetics, right? Like somebody who is a wealthy white person has a very different body than somebody who's working class, right? They do different forms of work. They enjoy different types of leisure, right? You think about the standard upper class white guy's body, it's a thin body. What do they do as recreation? They play tennis, they jog, right? These are certain set of activities, right, that produce a certain form of body. It's a very different body than you get if you play football, or if you lift weights, or if you ... right? We place different value on those different body types, right? And so they become immediate, almost signifiers, immediate sort of things that we see that we make judgments on often. Does it make sense? So that's forms of cultural capital. But that's not the only forms of capital he has. We also have things like institutional capital. You may have a lot of money, you may know all the right wines, but you could be a college dropout. Well, you lack institutional capital. These may be enough to make up the difference, right? But you're still lacking something in comparison to somebody who goes and actually gets a diploma someplace, right? If you're competing for a job, right? Are all diplomas, we kind of said this last class, are all diplomas created equal? No, where you went to school really matters in terms of institutional capital. So it's like, how much schooling do you have? Where is that schooling from? I went to a conference one time, and this was a conference that was held on, do you guys know Brown University? It was held on Brown University campus, and I'm coming from a state school, right? So like, not super fancy. Good middle class place to get a graduate degree. I'm not middle class, so I'm actually kind of like upwardly mobile for having gone there. But anyways, you went to this conference, right? And people would walk around, they'd look at your name tag to see what school you went to, and if it wasn't high enough, they'd just turn around and walk away. Right? So like you think about like, and that's sort of forms of institutional capital. these like various institutions give you credibility, right, in different ways, right? So there's different levels of credibility that match those different institutions, right? So that's the form of institutional capital. Can you use institutional capital to get money? Yeah, I mean, that's what most of you guys are trying to do in some ways, right? Like, most of you guys plan on getting jobs at the end of all this, right? Like, you don't just come here because you like talking about depressing things with sociology professors all day long, right? No. You're here trying to earn institutional capital so that you can transfer that capital. You gotta love the money play on terms of Bordeaux. So you can transfer that capital into some form of financial capital. It might not be like a huge amount of financial capital, but you're trying to gain money from doing that, right? That's kind of how this works, right? The last one is social. Social is a little pretty easy. We can think of it just in terms of who do you know, right? Knowing different people opens different doors. Most people get jobs through people they actually know, right? So in combination, all these things play into each other, but they're not quite the same thing, and people compete over them. And that's essentially how we end up with sort of our class divisions replicating over time, and not replicating over time. Okay, have a good day. See you guys Friday.